This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Jeff Dubrow. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world. Manju Varma, Commissioner for Systemic Racism in the province of New Brunswick. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Jeff. It's great to be here.
Tell us a bit about what this position entailed.
Absolutely. So the first thing I want to say is it was the first provincial position as a commissioner on systemic racism. There are a couple, I believe Montreal and maybe Calgary have municipal commissioners on systemic racism with a very different mandate. But from a Canada-wide perspective, New Brunswick showed a lot of courage and a lot of leadership by having this position as its first in Canada. My mandate was pretty broad. I was asked to look at the extent and scope of systemic racism for all racialized, marginalized communities. So that includes international students, our Indigenous communities, our long-standing communities, for example, our Black communities, our newcomers, our long-standing immigrants. So really a breadth of anyone who is part of a racialized community in New Brunswick.
And what was the experience like?
Big picture, it was extremely draining. I have no fear in saying that, there were days that it was actually quite traumatic. Even though my mandate focused on systemic racism, a lot of people, don't know the difference between overt and systemic racism, in particular with people who are experiencing it. So it was nothing for me to have 3-4 calls a day with people explaining their overtly racist experiences.
I see.
And, you listen to those stories of vulnerable people, vulnerable children, it gets to you. So big picture, it was really hard. It was, like I said, it was traumatic at times, not just for me, but for my team as well.
Mm-hmm.
There were times where I just had to say, okay, everybody, tomorrow, we're not talking to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to read, or we're going to focus on something else, or we're going to take the day off. We had to do that. More particularly, the experience was really, it was diverse. There are people with very different experiences as racialized communities. Speaking with women, for example, their needs, their concerns, as you can imagine, were completely different than their male counterparts. Even,
mm-hmm.
If we looked at a tiny microcosm, for example, Muslim new arrivals. Mm-hmm. Even within that tiny microcosm, the differences that the needs the children had, the experience they had versus women, versus seniors who were coming, to join their family, to perhaps be part of childcare, or to have support from people who were here, from the men who were trying to find work, were trying to, come to terms with this new culture, this new environment, and their role in it. So there was a lot of diversity, which sounds ironic that I wouldn't know that, or I wouldn't expect that, but it was even at a greater scale than what I expected.
And let's just go back and unpack that overt
Mm-hmm.
versus systemic racism. I think I get a sense of what you're referring to, that you were getting calls from individuals who saw you almost like an ombudsman there
Yes.
too. But maybe you can talk a bit about that.
Sure. So overt racism is what we often think of when we hear the word racism. So you're out somewhere and someone calls you a racist name,
mm-hmm.
Tells you to go back to where you came from, overtly tries to harm you, whether it's verbally,
right.
physically.
Right.
In the old days, signs that said, Irish need not apply, or
mm-hmm.
No Jews allowed. Those are overt practices. There is no confusion
right.
over the attack that's being made on you. Systemic racism is about policies, about the way we do things that automatically privilege or advantage mainly the white population, the white English population, if we look at New Brunswick, and disadvantage other groups. Now, I'm talking about systemic racism, but there's systemic discrimination as well. So, from a systemic racism perspective, if we think about the school calendar, and this is an example I use a lot because it's something a lot of people can connect to, right? Either they have children in school or they experience school. The school calendar has not changed dramatically, right? I mean, you have children. Is there some holiday that they have now that we haven't had in the last 50 years?
Right.
There's very few.
Right.
But if you were to take out the ones that have to do with the Christian, the Christian religion, or the European experience, there would be very few holidays left, right? So I grew up at a time where we had Christmas. Your biggest vacations were Christmas and Easter, and then summer, of course. My kids grew up with the same calendar, but there are lots of children in our school system right now, as our schools become more and more diverse, who celebrate Ramadan, who celebrate Diwali, who celebrate the high holidays in September, right? So that's a really good example of policies that you don't even think about, but they do advantage some people over others.
So is that systemic discrimination or systemic racism?
Well, if I would just look at the holidays that have to do with cultural, then it would be systemic racism, right? So, for example, I have never taken Diwali off. Right? Even when I was my own boss, I didn't take it off because the rest of the world is still working.
Right.
So, I'm sure if I went to my employer and said, Diwali is, like my Christmas, can I have the day off? They'd probably say yes and think that they're being very inclusive. However, there's probably still important meetings being planned that day. And is that going to change? No, it doesn't. Another example, when I was at the University of Toronto, one thing that came to attention was that the MCATS exam was often written during Ramadan. Now, so that means that any Muslim student who is following, their faith and following Ramadan is writing that exam, a very important, life-changing exam, at a time when they're not physically at their peak. Right? And
that's a very good point.
Yes, and when it was brought to the attention of the university, it was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Let's change it. So it's not so much that people don't want to change things to make things more inclusive. It is that they just don't know, because systemic racism, systemic discrimination is so part of our fiber. We don't think about it.
And it's interesting. So you said that policies need to change. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yes. So again, school policies, for example, your attendance matters, and it should, absolutely. But how can we make that more inclusive so that if you do take time off for Ramadan, if you do take the high holidays off, can those holidays, can those religious observances be exempt? That's a policy thing, right? Or does that, right now what that means is if a child takes that off, that they are noted as being absent.
Similar to if you were, you were saying about yourself when you were working for yourself, you're choosing to take a day off. It's not a sort of, even if you're an employee, a statutory holiday, or you can do it, but it's at your own.
It's at my own expense.
It's
a vacation day, exactly.
Right, yeah.
Whereas people get Christmas off, and that's not a vacation day. That's given to them.
Right.
So I like to focus on examples like that because they're so normalized. They're so simple. If we think about systemic discrimination on a wider scale, prior to COVID, many employers, many managers said, well, no, we can't have people working from home. How will I know that they're working?
That's right.
Right. And that disadvantaged people with disabilities. I remember speaking to this one person who asked her employer if on really cold days, if she could work from home. She was in a wheelchair. And she was living in Ottawa. On super cold days, the battery in her electric wheelchair would freeze. And so she could only get halfway to work. And what she was told was, no, if you want to be accommodated, you have to let us know which days you're working from home. Like it has to be every Monday or every Wednesday. So they were essentially asking her to predict the weather for winter. Instead of saying, you know what, yes, we can accommodate that. We need to change the policy because the policy says that you need to indicate which day you're taking off. We need to change the policy so that when those minus 20 or minus 30 days happen, we're not expecting you to wheel yourself to our office.
And I saw a couple of examples in your report where you referred to staff of a particular institution saying, I'm sorry, that's the policy. We can't accommodate your request. Do you want to give another example or two of how that manifested itself?
Well, we saw that in the healthcare system. On the website for the College of Physicians, the policy for getting licensed if you were internationally educated, or what they used to say, foreign credentials. Even that word, foreign, right? It's like something unknown. I prefer to use internationally educated. So if you went to their website, their policy was that if you were from one of their preferred countries, and it actually said preferred, and I'm sure you can guess what those countries were.
UK, New Zealand,
Australia. Exactly. Yeah. So then you had sort of a fast track to get your license. If you were not, then the policy said that you had to go through these multiple hurdles and barriers, many of which, if you needed to overcome them, you needed to have a network already in place. Like, for example, having a physician who's willing to supervise your work. So you kind of already need to have connections, which logic says you probably wouldn't if you're a newcomer. So those sort of policies, asking here in New Brunswick, our nurses are generalists. They can work in the ER, they can work in pediatrics, and in some other countries, nurses do specific tasks. So they're an ER nurse, or they're a pediatric nurse, or a gerontologist nurse. So we had nurses. I spoke to a nurse who had 20 years experience in the ER in another country, but couldn't get licensed here because she wasn't experienced. But we're crying for nurses.
We sure are.
So the policy itself doesn't make sense, first of all, and is extremely discriminatory to the point that it actually harms New Brunswickers. So you really have to sit down and say, why do we have this policy? And the answer to why, and this is an answer that was given to me by a high-ranking board member of one of the health agencies. Well, the answer is we've always done it that way.
Sure.
We're familiar with physicians from these countries, and so it makes it easier to do it. That's just another way of saying we've closed doors to certain countries and we're gatekeeping. Right?
That's fascinating. And as you know, the Gender-Based Analysis Plus is very much about, which I do a lot of work on, is very much about making sure that women and intersectional marginalized population groups are taken into consideration when policies are being developed.
Yes.
What evidence did you find that was the case here in the province of New Brunswick in terms of that policy development process?
Well, the province is very quick to tell you that they're the only province in Canada. Now, I haven't checked this out, so I'm going on what they've told me, that they're the only province in Canada that do a GBA plus analysis of their budget and of their cabinet decisions. But the thing is, cabinet decisions are private. They're secret.
Confidential. Yeah.
So we don't know the extent to which GBA plus analysis is done to these decisions. So the whole point, please correct me if I'm wrong, because you know far more about this than I do, but I think one of the major points around GBA plus analysis is a transparency to say, we've thought about this decision or this policy from a multiple of lenses. So if you are only applying it to confidential decisions, it seems ironic to me.
Very much so.
So one of the things that I talk about in my report is, yes, my report is about systemic racism, but we need to deal with systemic discrimination. And many of the things that people were telling me are amplified because they're female, because they're, they're disabled, or they have mental health issues, or they're young. So it is, I'm hoping that a GBA plus analysis is done for every one of the recommendations that the government decides to enact on.
And looking at your report, I took some quotes that I thought we could talk about that come very much to the touch on the GBA plus, different aspects of GBA plus. For example, your report stated that when we discuss current social, and this is a quote, current social and economic concerns impacting New Brunswickers, we need to ensure that we remember to add the various lenses of marginalized communities. What did you mean by that?
What I meant was that my recommendations, although they're meant to fight systemic racism, and this is going to sound strange, I know, but they're meant to fight the best possible situation of systemic racism. So if we look at our workforce and we see that, men of color are not being promoted, well, let's also look at women of color, mothers of color. What extra barriers do they have? Let's also look at, our newcomers who perhaps have experienced traumatic situations at home because of political instability or because of, personal experiences. So it's like you're suffering from systemic racism, you're experiencing systemic racism, and that's bad enough. But what if you're not the best of the worst? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, like, for example,
layers, it's like peeling the layers of the
exactly.
onion. Yeah.
Like, I experienced systemic racism, but I live a very comfortable life. I have lots of privileges, economic privileges, health privileges. I experienced something that is ironically called, positive racism, or the model citizen being of Asian descent. So I can only imagine what it must be like for people who don't have those privileges that I do, because they're suffering from the same systemic racist policy or initiative, but they have all these other layers to have to deal with as well.
But now, in your report, I would say specifically made an effort to highlight almost at the very beginning that you had moved to Canada or to New Brunswick when you were 2 years old.
Yes.
Do you want to share your lived experience? And I think it's important that I didn't want to sort of label that as as an Asian woman. I'm really let you label your own intersectional experience. Do you want to talk about how you faced maybe policies or programs or services that you clearly felt had not been designed with you in mind sometime throughout your...
Yes. Well, I should make it clear that when we came to Canada, when I was 2, my dad was already here. He was a student at a Canadian university.
Oh, wow.
He says he was the first East Indian student at a Canadian university in the education faculty.
Wow.
Now, I don't know if that's true. That's what he tells me. So we're going to believe him.
Hopefully there won't be a lot of fact checkers.
Yes, hopefully.
Yeah.
So he came here as an international student. And then once he finished, my mother and I came. So I was 2 years old. So we actually moved to Nova Scotia first.
Okay.
And my dad was a teacher. And the program that he was part of was the Nova Scotia government wanted to bring students over, international students over, kind of like New Brunswick is doing right now, because they didn't have enough teachers.
Right.
So they said, if you come over and become a teacher, you will get your instant PR status. So it was, it was very attractive. So my dad was part of that. Yes, permanent residence. Yes, I think at the time it was called landed immigrancy.
Yeah.
Yes. So my dad came over on that. He finished. He got a job teaching math, but like a lot of government initiatives, not a lot of oversight. So all of a sudden there were too many teachers. So what the Nova Scotia government did was it fired all of its non-Canadian teachers, regardless of tenure. So my dad lost his job. I was 5 at the time, and I had a younger sister. Moncton was a booming town, so it was the growing town, so they decided to move to Moncton. So that's how we came to New Brunswick.
Wow.
So ways, and I'm only looking at this in retrospect because I was 5. Right?
Yep.
But one of the things that happened when I started school is that my grade 1 teacher told my dad to stop speaking Hindi at home because I would learn to speak English with an accent. So I essentially lost my mother tongue. But here's the funny thing, Jeff. My grade 1 teacher was British. So she actually spoke English with an accent, right? And really, we all speak English with an accent. I mean, I joke around and say, only Maritimers can make car a 4-syllable word, right?
Right.
So the idea that somehow I would learn to speak English, and I did speak English. I was not learning it. I was fluent in English. But as a result, my parents stopped speaking Hindi at home. And so now I'm the only daughter of 5 that understands it completely.
Wow.
My sister of 2, who's 2 years younger than me, she's pretty good as well. But the other ones, we'll make family jokes. They don't get it, right? And I don't speak it anymore.
Now, was that a policy or was that a behavior of an individual?
It was a behavior of an individual.
But probably much more.
Yes.
Right.
But, part of the larger policy, education policy of everyone speaking English on the playground. I mean, there were French kids in my class, and I know they were French because I was friends with them. They lived in my neighborhood where they did not speak French in the playground, right? Because you weren't allowed to. So what my grade 1 teacher said to my dad was really an offshoot of that policy where everyone here needs to be the same. We all sat in desks, all in rows. We all learned the same thing. This social policy of how do we eradicate difference, and we saw the extreme of that with residential schools.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the education system, are there particular aspects that would ways that would improve the development of policies that are more conducive to women and intersectional population groups that you can identify?
Well, I think it's a two-pronged approach. First of all, you have to fight the policies or the thinking that support those policies in the first place of sameness or how we treat difference. So as I said, when I went to school, and probably the same thing for you, uniformity was really pushed. We were all the same. Things, everybody learned the same. And anything that was different was really pushed aside. So if you had a student who learned differently, they were sent to separate schools, for example. And that was made very clear to us. We knew the kids who were being sent elsewhere. And then we kind of shifted to, difference being so normalized that it too became into the policy. So, only mothers took maternity leave. There was no paternity leave because, of course, it's the moms that want to stay home.
Right.
And then we saw, more passive executions of those policies where boys would be in education, be supported to go into the maths, into sciences, and girls were streamed out. Right? That wasn't an actual policy, but it was a social offshoot of that policy where we would encourage girls to go into what we called, the softer professions.
Social offshoot, I like that term.
And then we went into the colorblind approach, right? And where we saw, I hear teachers say that still today. I see all my kids as the same. I don't see color. I don't see ability. It sounds lovely.
Yes, it does sound lovely.
It does, doesn't it? It sounds so kumbaya, so fair. But you're right. We know the child who comes to school, with an iPad in their backpack is not the same as the child who comes to school without breakfast. And we need to recognize those differences if we're going to help kids. So to say that the child who is a refugee, who has experienced trauma, who is trying to settle into a new culture, into a new world, is the same as a child from a multi-generational New Brunswick family, to say you see them the same ignores the barriers and the challenges that that first child is experiencing.
Yeah.
And for some reason, education, our institutes of education are really good at that. And I don't know why, because there is no data that says that that's successful. In fact, when children succeed, when programs succeed, is when we actually say, okay, we need to respect difference and look at difference. That's when we get the best results. So I don't know why we keep going back to this standardized, colorblind, approach. It boggles my mind.
It's fascinating. So I've learned a lot over the years about the issues that we're talking about. And I started working on GBA Plus really when, I was working on other aspects of gender budgeting, but prior to that, but really when the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister at the time announced at the federal level, because I was living in Ottawa and working in Ottawa, that GBA Plus was going to be applied to all programs and policies that were going to be approved by Cabinet. And I started working more actively on these initiatives. Was really learned a lot. But I realized soon on, and I like to say this at conferences, that you don't come to a situation as a white male, even though I'm of Jewish descent, as a white male who is extremely privileged. You don't cross into a zone of enlightenment where you just say, that's it, I am now enlightened, I know everything. Yeah. I mean, there's things that you've explained to me that I've learned already. I've already changed my assumptions, and I've got to be open for that.
Yes.
Every day.
Well, as do I. I mean, that was one of the challenges of being Commissioner on Systemic Racism, is I was expected, for better or for worse, to be able to speak for Indigenous people. I was expected to be able to speak for, our early settling Black communities, for refugees. I mean, there's no way I could do that. And I was fortunate in that my report reflects over 1,000 New Brunswick voices.
Incredible.
So I was very fortunate and that's part of the I guess that I'm proud of, is that I was able to attract those voices, because there's no way I could have made those recommendations on my own, because I didn't know enough, and I still don't know enough.
No.
Like you've pointed out, it's a work in progress, right?
It's constantly being open and learning new things.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that I learned, I was so excited about GBA Plus, and I was chairing a lot of national conferences, and there were sort of two types of people who would come to those conferences. One sort of type of person, for lack of a better term, were civil servants that were working on GBA Plus, and they were looking for tools and tips on how to apply GBA Plus to their work. But there were other people who were there more of activists, as activists, and they were saying this isn't enough. And I think what they meant by that was that GBA Plus is, it's great looking forward in terms of new policies. And this is what it took me some time to learn, again, as a privileged white male. It took me time to understand that actually means that there are lots of things that need to be dismantled in the background that will never be subject to a GBA Plus examination.
Right.
I imagine that must have come up a lot in the work that you did.
It did. I mean, how do you do that? Right? We have apologies. We have. The arts are very good at that. The literature is very good at that, looking at past situations and influencing how we think today. But it's not an easy thing to do. And one example that comes to mind with the federal government is we used to have something in the federal government called the fruit machine. Are you familiar with that? So I'm going to get my dates wrong.
I'm picturing a vending machine with food in it, but I really doubt that's actually what you're talking about.
That's not what it is, unfortunately. So I'll give you the vague descriptions, because I'm missing the details right now. I used to know them off the top of my head, but somewhere in the 60s and 70s, the RCMP worked with scientists to come up with a machine that you could attach to people, and it would show you images. And based on how you responded to those images, the machine was able to determine whether or not you were homosexual. Hence the term, the fruit machine.
Oh, my goodness.
And this was used on civil servants right up until the 80s. So this is not something that predates you and I. And if somebody was determined to be a homosexual by this, this really crazy machine, they were fired. They lost their public service
right into the
job.
1980s.
Right into the 1980s. There's a great documentary, and you just Google The Fruit Machine, and it will come up. And it's a documentary that has conversations with real life victims of this. Now, recently, just in the past few years, Trudeau has apologized for this. But for those people, the ones who were fired, the ones who escaped being fired, that were quote unquote caught, how are they doing in the civil service right now? Because many of them are still in the civil service, right?
Right.
How do you work in an environment, even when that environment starts to say, oh, we're looking at people who are part of the 2S LGBTQ plus community as an equity-seeking group now. We're recognizing that. That's great. But what about all the trauma that you've carried for that many years? Those are the questions I have around GBA plus analysis, and how does that work? I guess I put that back to you, right? Like, what do you do with that? And, the other thing I've heard, and I'm sure you've heard it too, and probably said it, is GBA Plus is not an add-on. We've seen that, right?
Yep.
You do all the work, and then you say, oh, right, we got to check off that GBA Plus box. All right, let's look at this again. Yeah. But all the work's been done.
Yeah.
So then it becomes an inconvenience. It doesn't create a better policy. So those are concerns that I have, and so I'm glad that there's people like you doing that work and encouraging people, or showing people this needs to be done at the beginning. You need to be thinking about this all along, not just of the bow that you wrap on this perfect policy.
Right. You are a very skilled interviewee, flipping the question back to the interviewer. I'm totally kidding.
You know a lot more about this than me, so I'm not going to pretend to answer that question.
No, this is great. This is great. This is what conversations are all about. And I do think that, I mean, there's no reason. I'll take the federal government as an example, because I think, as you've acknowledged, that New Brunswick is at a much more nascent level in terms of GBA plus. But I think there's no reason why any government could not go back and look at previous policies or existing policies that have been adopted from a GBA plus lens. I think the problem is and this is not excuse making, but the reason that they're probably reticent to do it is it's a can of worms.
Oh, absolutely.
And it would require incredible capacity.
Right.
But I think I think there are many people who don't feel, I was going to say cynical, and I decided not to use that word because that's the wrong, that implies they have some kind of chip on their shoulder, right? But that feel that's not going far enough. And I can see that. So it's a question that really has to be asked. And I think a province like New Brunswick that is only, if they're at the nascent level, it may not be the right time to ask that question, but it's in terms of a sequencing perspective, but I think from, at the federal level, I think it should be a question that somebody should be shouting out at one of Trudeau's press conferences, or the current wage minister, Marcy Ian, and sort of saying, how are we going to do that? Because I think that's important.
How are we going to reconcile this?
Yeah, how are we going to reconcile
if we're going to use
that?
a popular term, how are we going to reconcile this? And it is a big question, and probably, right now there's lots of academics writing books about this and working on this. I don't know. But one thing I will say, because I experienced this in my own work as commissioner. So, and it's going to sound like I'm complaining, and maybe I am.
Well, after what you've gone through, I think you have a right to complain a little bit.
If I'm complaining.
She's so negative. No, not at all. Not at all.
No, it's actually the opposite. It's actually, groups that are saying you didn't take this far enough. And I understand that. Again, my experiences with overt and systemic racism are traumatic. But compared to other groups, I fared well. They weren't, if I can say this, traumatic enough.
Sure.
Like if we're gonna start looking at hierarchy, which I really don't think we should do. But one of the criticisms that I received in my report is I didn't go far enough, right? I understand that. My response, and I don't know if it's an excuse or whatever, but it's my response, is there needs to be a place for everyone. There needs to be the place for the people who are screaming from the rooftop saying, this is not enough. We need to totally dismantle the system. We need those voices. But we also need the voices of people saying, okay, I'm willing to be patient. I'm willing to take this journey one step at a time, because our listeners are so diverse. So if our listeners are diverse, then the speakers need to be equally diverse and leave space for everyone. It does no one any good to say, you're not radical enough. You're colonized. There's lots of examples. You're a sellout. And I'm not just talking about me. I'm talking about.
I totally feel like a sellout. 1,000%.
You're not an ally enough.
Right.
I have a real issue with that.
Yeah.
For me, it's like literacy. That's the example I've started to use, a metaphor. When a child is in grade 1 and they bring you this book that has like 4 pages in it, right? And it says something like, this is a dog. This is my dog. That child's reading. We would never say, here's a grade 5 book. Oh, you can't read that? You're not literate. No, that child's literate for where they are right now. And when they get to grade 5 and they can read a grade 5 book, it's more sophisticated, it's more complex, and they are literate. We wouldn't give them a university tome and say, here, read this thesis. Oh, you're not literate. So that's how I see activism as well. We're all literate at different places, and it does no good for somebody who is extremely literate, who's able to throw out, the latest academic terms, to somebody who's in grade 5 and then saying, you have no right to be part of this conversation because you're not saying enough. You're not doing enough. Does that make sense?
It does. And actually, it's funny. I'm my little conversation going on in my head right now is that we're kind of playing Jeopardy, the game Jeopardy, because you answered the question that I was going to ask.
Oh, okay.
So now I'll pose the question, which is just slightly different.
Right.
Which is my concern is a lot of the work that I do is related to strengthening democratic practices, and I try to call out in Canada. I believe philosophically that unlike 30 years ago when we sort of looked at democracy as a victory over authoritarianism and communism and all that kind of stuff, that now we've got to really call out those practices in our own country. And we are seeing examples of populism and democratic backsliding, certainly in Canada.
Absolutely.
Much, obviously in the United States as well. And the more that there are progressive voices like yours, the more that there is going to be people on the other side who are going to feel very threatened by those messages, and are going to push back hard and say, look, I'm also suffering as a white male. I'm not talking about myself, but
I understand.
And those are the people who voted for Donald Trump. We know that, right?
Yeah.
People who feel that they've been discriminated against, and why are these other people getting all this special consideration? Did you face that over the last year in dialogue with people, and how much pushback is there out there?
Yes, I guess the quick answer is yes, I did. I faced it in 2 ways. One was more covert. So I've said this before, I've shared this before, the hate mail that we got. Mainly emails to my office or people who would message me through Facebook. So I actually, really slowed down my Facebook usage because, just outright hate messages. I said during my press conference when I released the report that I actually received a message from somebody telling me they knew where my children went to school.
Oh my goodness.
And which makes you think, like, why am I doing this work?
Yep.
At that point, you're like, why am I here? But the other thing that surprised me and was more in the open is how much pushback I got from diverse groups, the groups that I was actually supposed to be representing.
Really?
And I think it's a colonial mindset. I think there is such a history of divide and conquer, right? Like I saw this cartoon, I loved it. It was a man, and he's got a whole bunch of cookies in front of him. He's sitting at a table. There's a whole bunch of cookies sitting in front of him, and then there's also a gentleman of color and a woman, and they each have one cookie in front of them, and the man is saying to them, "You better watch that person. They're going to take your cookie." So we have been conditioned through colonization, through imperialism, to be this divide and conquer. Like, you're my enemy because you have one cookie and I have one cookie.
Right.
And if you get more of the equity pie, I'm somehow going to suffer.
That's right.
Right.
It's a zero-sum game.
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I was disappointed, and I say this in my report and in the message from the commissioner, I actually say this, I was disappointed by the number of times I saw infighting. I saw this, my situation is worse. And absolutely, I could break it down and say, yes, from a youth achievement level, Indigenous people are worse. From a settlement level, refugees are worse. Like, we can play that game, but I don't see the value of it. And that's something that I found really problematic when I was doing my work. And now that I've released my report, some of the feedback has been like that. And, I'm quite comfortable in saying that I think the media helps ignite and flames those fires to have that conversation. There was so much emphasis put on what was not in that report rather than what was in that report.
Sure. Last question. What are your hopes that those recommendations, or your prospects, or the prospects for those recommendations in your report being implemented?
I'm actually very hopeful for a couple of reasons. A, I'm a hopeful person. Right?
Well, you'd have to be in a job like this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We can't do this type of work and not be hopeful,
That's
right?
True. That's true.
Because you just wouldn't get up in the morning.
Right.
So I'm a hopeful person. The second reason is, as I said at the beginning, the province showed incredible courage and leadership to have a position such as mine in the first place. So, if lightning can strike the same place twice. And so they were courageous doing it, or creating it. I think they're going to show courage doing it as well. The other reason is I saw incredible passion and dedication in the civil service. I talked to people in all different departments. So not just in the diversity inclusion sector of a department.
Right. The converts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
More than the choir, more than the Vismins or the Indigenous. I saw everyday people who are doing their best to educate themselves and ensure that the work that they do is inclusive, is equitable, and being very self-reflective in that work. So I saw that a lot, and that cannot be understated. So I am very hopeful that the civil service of New Brunswick, that there is a large mass of people there that want to do this right. Finally, I want to pass the baton to community organizations and say to them, find something in the report that speaks to you, and then just put your full force of voice behind it. I don't expect everyone to agree with every one of my recommendations. I would be highly suspect if someone did, but I'm hoping there's something there for everyone. And our organizations, our multicultural organizations, settlement organizations, our stakeholders, they're incredibly resilient because the processes to help people to fight discrimination is not easy. So I'm hopeful because of the strength that they've shown as well.
And that's a very good point. In closing, I've done a lot of work with parliaments around the world, including legislatures across Canada. And I think, I felt that I've not emphasized enough the important role of civil society.
Yes.
Because they are the ones who are going to push for, and unfortunately we do have a very robust civil society in Canada, and that's probably what's keeping us moving forward. So Manju Varma, congratulations on all the work that you've done to get this report out, the blood, sweat, and tears that I'm sure went into it.
Yes, lots of tears. No blood.
No blood.
No blood.
Sweat and tears.
Sweat and tears.
That's
yes.
right. But congratulations. That's a huge monumental accomplishment. And I like the way you put the idea of passing the baton to others now to push for implementation.
Yes. My work here is done.
Absolutely. For now.
For now. Yes.
It's been great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Great talking to you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Human Coined is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.